Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a world most of us only ever see through a tourist camera lens, the great stone castles of medieval Europe. They look magnificent in photographs. Towering walls, grand halls, flickering torchlight. But if you actually had to live inside one, especially on a winter night, you'd learn fast that the real enemy wasn't an invading army. It was the cold itself. Before we go further, if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive, drop a like and subscribe so more of these find their way to you. And if you're watching live, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I always love seeing that. Now settle in, dim the lights if you can, and let's walk together into a medieval night. You step onto a stone floor worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Even fully dressed, you can feel the chill working its way through your clothes. These walls weren't built to hold warmth in, they were built to keep enemies out, and in doing so, they became remarkably good at holding the cold in instead. Once the sun went down, the temperature inside dropped almost as fast as it did outside. Within an hour, you'd see your own breath fogging in front of your face. Castle architects spent their genius on moats, drawbridges, and arrow slits. Insulation simply wasn't part of the blueprint. And here's a detail that surprises a lot of people. Many northern European castles were deliberately built on exposed, windswept hills. Militarily, that made perfect sense. You could spot an enemy from miles away. But for anyone trying to sleep, it was miserable. Wind found every gap in the shutters and every crack under a door, and it never seemed to stop. You might assume the fireplace would save you. It didn't, not really. Even a roaring fire in the great hall only warmed a small circle immediately around it. Walk 10 feet away, and the air turned cold again. By the time you reached your bedchamber, the temperature could feel closer to a wine cellar than a place meant for sleeping. There's a strange detail buried in surviving travel accounts from the period. Visitors sometimes wrote about waking up to frost on the inside of their bedroom walls, or finding their wash basin frozen solid by morning. Chroniclers barely commented on it. It was just an accepted part of winter. If your room didn't grow a thin skin of frost on the coldest nights, you were the exception, not the rule. And yet people survived, not by luck but by ritual. As night fell, entire households followed routines designed to trap whatever heat they could. The goal was always the same: shrink the livable space as the temperature dropped. Fires were banked low and slow burning. Beds were built with heavy curtains. Clothing was layered until movement itself became awkward. Everyone hoped the wind outside wouldn't find its way in. Picture the bed itself, a tall wooden frame raised well above the floor. That height wasn't about luxury or status. It was strategy. Cold air sinks, and raising the sleeping surface meant escaping the coldest layer hovering just above the stone. Even so, the chill radiated upward from the floor, and you'd feel it the moment you slid beneath the covers. Historians still go back and forth on how much castle life actually improved over the centuries. Some argue that heavy tapestries and draperies genuinely transformed cold stone rooms into something livable. Others insist the cold simply won every time, no matter how much fabric you hung on the walls. The honest answer probably sits in the middle. Things got somewhat better, but never comfortable in any way we'd recognize today. Now imagine lying back in that bed. The wooden frame creaks beneath you. Straw bedding rustles with every shift of your body. Outside, wind moans against the battlements. The only light comes from a small oil lamp, its flame struggling against the draft. Your toes ache with cold even though you're still dressed in your daytime clothes. Somewhere down a corridor, you hear a guard's boots echo against stone as the night watch changes. A dog barks faintly in the courtyard below, the sound muffled by thick walls. None of it warms you. It just reminds you how unforgiving the world beyond your blankets really was. Here's something that tends to surprise people. Peasants in their small timber cottages were often warmer than the nobles in their stone keeps. A single hearth fire could heat an entire small home efficiently, while a lord's vast chamber swallowed the same fire's warmth without ever feeling it. The irony wasn't lost on people at the time either. Letters from clergy and traveling nobles describe grand beds and bitter, sleepless nights in the very same paragraph. Some travelers were advised to pack extra cloaks, not as a fashion choice, but as a survival necessity. Surviving a medieval winter night wasn't about simply pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It meant layering fabric deliberately, stacking furs with purpose, pulling curtains shut tight, and sometimes sharing your bed with another person, or an animal, purely for the warmth they provided. Every choice was about building a small pocket of livable air inside a building that, by both nature and design, fought against you. That single realization changes how you think about medieval life. These weren't just knights and ladies, monks and merchants. Every one of them was, in some quiet way, a survivalist. Bedtime wasn't relaxation. It was a nightly project, refined over generations, just to make it to morning intact. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed with central heating humming quietly somewhere in the walls, spare a thought for the people who once lay shivering in stone chambers exactly like the one we just imagined. They endured nights that should have been unbearable, and the tricks they used to do it are worth exploring, one layer at a time. You leave the bedchamber behind in your mind and walk back down into the great hall, the one place in most castles where warmth had any real fighting chance. If the bedchamber felt like a tomb of stone and draught, the great hall was at least alive. Long wooden tables stretch across the floor, polished smooth by years of elbows and spilled ale. The air carries the smell of roasted meat, damp wool, and smoke that never quite escapes the rafters. A massive hearth fire burns at one end of the room, a stubborn square of orange light pushing back against the dark outside. This was where a castle felt most human after sunset. People gathered here not just to eat, but to soak up every bit of warmth they could before retreating to their freezing rooms. Servants moved quickly between tables carrying bread, ale, and bowls of thick pottage. Dogs wove between legs, hopping for dropped scraps. The room was loud, laughter, music, the clatter of cups, and for a little while you could almost forget that frost was already forming on the windows just a few feet away. Here's the plain truth about that fire. It was the only heating success story in the whole building, and even then only within a limited radius. Logs, sometimes entire tree trunks, were fed into it constantly through the winter months. If you had any rank at all, you claimed a seat close to the flames. Everyone else made do with whatever warmth drifted their way. The farther you sat from the fire, the colder the air became, until it felt like the stone itself was breathing out frost. One detail chroniclers occasionally mention is that winter feasts doubled as a kind of group heating strategy. Nobles scheduled their biggest gatherings during the coldest months specifically, because a hall packed with people generated real, noticeable warmth. Body heat from dozens or hundreds of guests, combined with a roaring fire, could turn an otherwise freezing hall into something almost cozy, for a few hours anyway. But that warmth never lasted. Once the feast wound down and guests drifted off to their rooms, the fire was allowed to die down to embers. Within an hour or two, the great hall slid right back into silence and cold. Imagine lingering by the fire those last few minutes, reluctant to leave, stretching your hands toward the last of the heat while your back already feels the chill creeping in from behind. You know what's waiting for you upstairs. Historians still debate whether some later medieval castles developed smarter ways to circulate heat from the hall vents, improved flues, that sort of thing. Some say yes, pointing to architectural changes in later centuries. Others argue this is wishful thinking projected backward onto a building style that simply wasn't designed with comfort in mind. The general consensus leans toward the harsher version of the story. The Great Hall was warm near the fire, and nowhere else. The walk from that hall to your bedchamber might be the most telling detail of all. You'd leave the golden firelight behind and step into a narrow stone passage lit by a single torch. The draft hit immediately, a sharp blade of cold air slicing through an arrow slit or an ill-fitting door. Your breath fogs again almost instantly. Whatever warmth you'd built up in the hall drains away in seconds, as if the castle itself were feeding on it. Some nobles apparently gave up on that walk altogether. Records mention high-backed benches pulled close to the hearth used as makeshift beds, with servants and guards sometimes collapsing near the embers rather than facing the cold climb to their proper rooms. Travelers, too, often complained more about that brief walk between warmth and cold than about the night itself, describing shivers that lasted for hours simply because of the shock of that transition. The Great Hall in the end wasn't just a dining room. It was a kind of ritual, a final gathering of warmth before everyone surrendered to the night. Every torch extinguished, every cup emptied, marked another step toward a long, cold stretch of darkness upstairs. Climb higher into the keep now, away from the fatting glow of the Great Hall, and the air shifts immediately. The warmth is gone, replaced by a damp, heavy cold that seems to settle into your bones. The walls here are thick, sometimes 10 or 12 feet of solid stone separating you from the world outside. On paper, that sounds like protection. In practice, it meant the cold had somewhere permanent to live. If you've ever stepped into an unheated basement in winter, you already know this feeling. Stone holds temperature the way a memory holds a feeling stubbornly, and for a long time. Even on a brief warm afternoon, the walls of a castle interior could stay locked in the deep chill of the previous week. Medieval builders understood strength. They understood permanence. Comfort, unfortunately, was never part of the equation. Historians generally agree that warmth in a castle rarely extended more than a few feet beyond any given fire. Step 10 feet away from the hearth, and you were back in an icebox. Written accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries describe noble families sitting directly in front of flames with cloaks pulled over their heads, while servants behind them stamped their feet just to keep blood moving. One detail that shows up repeatedly in travelers' journals is condensation. Moisture would gather on cold stone walls and run down in slow streaks, leaving rooms damp and faintly unpleasant. Imagine lying in bed and hearing the quiet, irregular drip of water hitting the floor somewhere in the dark, all night long. In some seasons, this dampness encouraged moss to grow right there on the interior walls. A castle in those moments could feel less like a home and more like a cave with better furniture. Modern scholars still argue about how much difference tapestries and wall hangings actually made. The popular image is grand stone halls lined with rich, heavy cloth. Some researchers believe these fabrics genuinely cut drafts and created small pockets of relative warmth behind them. Others think the effect has been exaggerated by later romantic retellings, pointing out that no amount of fabric could fully compete with unglazed windows and gaps under doors. The debate hasn't been settled, but it tells you something important. People were willing to try almost anything. Picture a bedchamber in the dead of January. The hearth fire is small, maybe already dying. The stone walls rise around you, slick in places with condensation, even though you're wrapped in layer after layer of wool. The bed sits in the center of the room, heavy curtains drawn close around it. Behind those curtains, the air might be a degree or two warmer, a tiny, carved-out pocket of tolerable cold. Beyond the curtains, the room itself feels like a sealed stone box. There was a psychological cost to all of this, too. Surviving letters from the period describe people dreading the cold more than they dreaded hunger or even illness, because hunger and illness eventually passed, but the cold returned every single night of the season, without fail. Living in a castle meant living with the quiet, constant awareness that you could never fully escape it, even inside your own home. The deeper you sit with this, the clearer the picture becomes. Sleeping in a medieval castle wasn't really about rest. It was a nightly, low-grade battle against an invisible opponent, one that never tired, never negotiated, and never lost interest. The battlefield was always the same. Your room, your bed, your own body trying to hold on to whatever warmth it could generate. Your boots crunch against something underfoot that isn't stone or carpet. It's a thick layer of rushes, dried reeds and grasses strewn across the floor. These weren't decoration. They were one of the simplest, most practical tools medieval households had for fighting the cold underfoot. Records from later medieval estates describe rushes being renewed several times a year, laid thick in halls and bedchambers alike. Freshly laid, they smelled faintly grassy and earthy, almost pleasant like a piece of the outdoors carried inside. For a little while, they padded footsteps, absorbed spills, and held a thin layer of warmth close to the ground. But that pleasant phase never lasted long. Food scraps, spilled ale, and the general mess of daily life worked their way down into the layer, and the rushes began to rot. Mice treated the floor as their personal playground. By the end of a long winter, the smell could become genuinely unpleasant. One period writer compared it, only half joking, to sleeping on a dung heap. What's interesting is that rushes did double duty. Yes, they trapped a little warmth, but they also soaked up the moisture constantly seeping from cold stone walls. Without them, every step would have meant walking across slick, freezing puddles. Some households got creative and mixed dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, meadowsweet, directly into the rushes, partly to mask the smell, partly just to make the room feel a little less grim. Architectural historians still debate how effective rushes actually were as insulation. Some argue they made a genuine difference between feet and freezing stone. Others see them as more of a cleanliness ritual than real climate control, pointing out that most heat loss happened through walls and ceilings, not floors. The honest answer is probably a bit of both, imperfect, but better than nothing. Now turn your attention to the bed itself, and specifically to what covered it. If there was one single tool in the fight against the cold, it was fabric, wool, linen, and fur, piled high enough that a sleeper could end up looking more like a wrapped parcel than a person. Linen sheets formed the base layer, smooth but not especially warm on their own. On top came heavy wool blankets, some described in old inventories as weighing as much as a small dog. If a household had money, fur covers came next. Fox, sable, even bear for the truly wealthy. There's a small, almost funny detail buried in some household records. Servants apparently joked that their masters, once tucked in under 5 or 6 heavy layers, could barely turn over in bed. Warmth came at the direct cost of mobility, and most people considered that a fair trade. Fur wasn't just about luxury either. Pelts from foxes, martens, and sheep provided genuinely dense insulation. One account describes a noblewoman from Burgundy who refused to travel anywhere, even in summer, without her fur-lined bed coverings, simply out of fear of catching a chill at night. It sounds excessive to modern ears, but in a world where drafts found their way into every room, that kind of caution made a certain practical sense. A stranger custom shows up in a few records too. Some households genuinely believed that sleeping under too much linen alone was unhealthy, on the theory that linen drew heat away from the body. To balance it, they'd layer wool above and below the linen, creating something like a fabric sandwich. Whether or not the theory held up, it shows how folklore and practical comfort got tangled together in everyday habits. Scholars also debate the social meaning behind all this fur and fabric. Was it really about survival, or mostly about displaying wealth and rank? Inventories show wealthy households owning enormous numbers of fur coverings, while poorer families made do with coarse wool and survived just fine. The likely answer is that it was both genuinely useful and a visible marker of status at the same time. Imagine yourself underneath all of it now. Wool scratches faintly against your skin. Fur lies heavy and warm above that. The sheer weight of the blankets presses you gently into the straw mattress below. You shift slightly, but not much. Too much movement risks letting cold air slip in under the covers. Your own breath warms the small pocket of air around your face, while the rest of your body depends entirely on layers of cloth standing between you and the room beyond. That, in the end, is the quiet truth of medieval sleep. To rest wasn't simply to lie down. It was to build a small fortress out of fabric and fur every single night and hope it held until morning. The bed frame itself deserves attention here because it was never just furniture. It was closer to a piece of engineering. Pull back the heavy curtains on a 4-poster bed, and you weren't just looking at someone's sleeping space. You were looking at a small, deliberately built climate inside an otherwise hostile room. Inventories from noble households describe these tall wooden frames in detail, carved oak or walnut posts rising well above head height, supporting a canopy overhead. That canopy wasn't purely decorative. Heavy curtains hung down all four sides, and once drawn shut, they trapped your own body heat in a small enclosed space. Think of it as a tent built inside a bedroom. Once those curtains closed, the difference could be dramatic. Your breath, your body heat, and the warmth held in the bedding itself all combined inside a pocket that might sit several degrees warmer than the open room. There's a memorable detail from the household of a French noblewoman who reportedly traveled with her entire bed dismantled and packed onto carts whenever she moved between residences. That might sound excessive, but the bed wasn't just furniture to her. It was closer to life support. Sleeping in an unfamiliar castle or guest house without her own canopy and curtains meant risking a genuinely miserable, possibly dangerous night. Some English sources mention curtains that were waxed or treated with oiled cloth specifically to block drafts more effectively. Picture pulling those curtains, shut heavy fabric, faintly smelling of beeswax, closing off not just cold air, but also light and sound. It created a strange kind of privacy in a world where true privacy was rare. Modern historians still discuss how much these canopy beds genuinely helped versus how much of their reputation comes from later romanticized depictions. Archaeological evidence does suggest the curtains were thick and layered enough to make a real difference. But some scholars argue the warmth was as much psychological as physical. The simple feeling of being enclosed and hidden away from a vast, cold room mattered almost as much as any measurable temperature change. Picture sliding into one of these beds. The frame creaks under your weight. Straw rustles beneath the mattress. You reach out and pull the curtain closed, and almost immediately the air around you feels different, still cold, but no longer under direct assault from drafts slipping through distant arrow slits. Your breath fogs more slowly now. Inside, you can hear only the faint sounds of your own movement, the bed curtain muffling the drip of water on stone, a distant cough somewhere down the hall, a dog barking outside. It wasn't a perfect system. Some nights, condensation froze the curtain stiff. Other nights, smoke from a nearby hearth drifted in and woke you coughing. But for most nobles, this canopy setup was the single best defense available against the nightly assault of cold. And it captures something important about medieval problem-solving in general. The solution was rarely a grand invention. It was a small, clever adaptation. No central heating. Build your own private climate bubble out of wood and fabric. No insulation in the walls. Hang heavy curtains and seal yourself inside them. Each night was, in a very real sense, a negotiation with the cold. And the canopy bed was about as close as anyone got to a temporary truce. Underneath all those curtains and blankets, the actual surface you slept on mattered just as much. In the Middle Ages, two main options dominated: the feather bed and the straw tick, and which one you had said a great deal about your place in the world. The feather bed was the luxury option. Imagine sinking into a large sack stuffed with goose or duck down, soft enough to cradle your whole body. Noble household inventories often list several feather beds as treasured, carefully maintained possessions, sometimes moved from castle to castle along with the family. A well-stuffed feather mattress could sit nearly a foot thick, a genuine cushion in an otherwise unforgiving room. But feather beds had a strange drawback too. They could trap heat so effectively that sleepers occasionally woke up drenched in sweat, even in the dead of winter. One surviving 15th century letter complains, half-jokingly, that a guest felt swallowed whole by his host's overly plush bed, sinking so deep into the feathers that turning over took real effort. Most people, though, slept on a straw tick, a large fabric sack stuffed with straw, hay, or reeds. Peasants used them. Soldiers used them. Even castles filled their less important rooms with them. They were cheap, easy to refill, and did a decent job of lifting a sleeper off cold stone or wood flooring. The downside was that straw flattened quickly, poked uncomfortably through thin fabric, and tended to attract fleas. Households had to regularly beat and shake the mattress just to fluff it back up and drive out pests. Some records mention herbs mixed directly into the straw, lavender or mint, mostly to mask the smell, but also believed to help repel insects. Anyone who's ever slept on a straw-filled mattress knows the earthy, musty smell that clings to it never fully goes away. Historians still debate how common feather beds really were outside the wealthiest households. Some argue they were rare luxuries reserved for the very top of society. Others point to middling household records that mention owning at least one, suggesting they were more widespread than commonly assumed. The evidence is patchy, but it's clear that what you slept on was recorded carefully enough to matter socially. Picture lying down on a straw tick in a cold, drafty room. The sack rustles unevenly beneath you, small lumps pressing against your back. Each shift releases a faint grassy scent mixed with the sharper note of dried herbs. Somewhere nearby, you hear the quiet scurry of mice in the floor rushes. The blankets above feel heavy and reassuring, even if the surface below reminds you that comfort here was never guaranteed. Now picture the alternative, a feather bed in a noble chamber. You sink into real softness, embraced on all sides by down. It feels wonderful at first, right up until the warmth becomes almost stifling. You shift, searching for a slightly cooler pocket of air, but the heavy curtains around the bed trap everything in. Eventually you drift off anyway, fully aware that even an overly warm feather bed beats a cold, scratchy straw one by a wide margin. That choice, straw or feathers, mirrored the broader social ladder of the period almost perfectly. But both were really answering the same basic question. How do you keep a human body alive through a long, cold night in a building that was never designed with comfort in mind? Even the sturdiest bed, piled with the best furs and tucked behind the thickest curtains, couldn't always win the fight alone. On the coldest nights, the real difference often came down to something simpler: company. Sleep alone in a stone room, and your body heat simply bleeds into the walls around you. Sleep beside someone else, and that warmth multiplies. Medieval households understood this instinctively, even if they didn't talk about it in those exact terms. Servants often slept in adjoining rooms, or on pallets at the foot of their lord's bed, partly for service and security, but partly for the simple, practical fact that more bodies in a space meant a few extra degrees of warmth. Records from medieval monasteries describe monks sleeping in long rows on simple cots, close enough that one could hear the next man breathing. The arrangement wasn't only about communal discipline, it was also a quiet form of survival. In crowded dormitories, shared body heat created a thin but real layer of insulation that no single monk could manage alone. One chronicler even remarked that the cloister, crowded as it was, ended up warmer than the Lord's own tower. Soldiers experienced something similar in barracks and camp quarters. Long rows of men on straw, cloaks doubled as blankets, the air thick with the smell of sweat and smoke. Uncomfortable, certainly, but for exhausted men in winter, sleeping shoulder to shoulder beat the alternative every time. Animals played a role here too, and dogs especially earned their reputation as living heaters. A couple of large dogs curled against your feet could mean the difference between numb toes by morning and something closer to comfort. Travelers occasionally wrote about requesting to sleep in stables rather than unheated guest rooms, simply because horses and cattle generated so much body heat that the air around them stayed noticeably warmer. Scholars still debate how socially acceptable bed-sharing actually was among the wealthy. Some argue it was fairly routine, trusted companions, close family, even strangers on the road sharing a bed out of necessity. Others believe the elite kept more distance, relegating servants to nearby pallets rather than the bed itself. What's clear is that among ordinary families, sharing a bed was simply normal. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all piled together under one heap of blankets, with privacy mattering far less than survival. Picture lying in such a bed now, pressed shoulder to shoulder with others. The first few minutes feel a little awkward, an elbow here, a cough there. But the warmth builds quickly, a shared cocoon of body heat. You feel the solid weight of a dog pressed against your feet, hear the steady breathing of the people around you, and slowly your shoulders unclench. There were downsides, of course. Fleas spread easily in these close quarters, and privacy was essentially non-existent. But weighed against the very real risk of a sleepless, freezing night alone, most people made the same calculation without much hesitation. Warmth won out over both comfort and dignity. What you wore to bed mattered just as much as what covered you. Unlike the modern habit of pajamas, or nothing at all, medieval sleepers often went to bed nearly as bundled up as they'd been all day. Clothing itself became part of the insulation system. The standard piece was the nightshirt, a long, loose linen garment, essentially an oversized tunic. Linen doesn't sound particularly warm, and it wasn't, but it was practical, easy to wash, breathable, gentle against the skin. Over that, depending on how cold the night was, people might add an extra wool tunic or even a cloak. The real standout piece, though, was the night cap. Simple cloth caps, tied under the chin or just pulled snugly over the head. The reasoning behind them was straightforward and honestly not far off from modern understanding. A significant amount of body heat escapes through the head, so covering it mattered. Illuminated manuscripts from the period show people tucked into bed with their heads neatly wrapped, looking almost ready for travel rather than sleep. A curious detail from a 15th century medical text recommends wrapping the feet in linen or wool before bed, specifically because the extremities were known to lose heat fastest. People wrapped their toes, ankles, and sometimes hands in strips of cloth, improvised socks and mittens for the night. Historians remain divided on how widespread dedicated sleepwear actually was. Some argue that for ordinary peasants, there was no real distinction between day clothes and night clothes. People simply slept in whatever they'd worn that day. Others point to wills and household inventories that specifically mention separate night linens, suggesting that at least middle and upper-class households did maintain distinct sleeping attire. Likely both versions are true, depending on region and wealth. Picture preparing for bed this way. You strip off the heaviest outer layers, slip into a long linen shirt, and pull a cap snugly over your ears. Cold air still nips at your neck until the blankets come up. Every layer adds one more small barrier against the room beyond. There was a second reason for all this covering up, beyond simple warmth, modesty. In a world where bed sharing was common, sleeping unclothed or even partially dressed wasn't considered acceptable. Even married couples are depicted in period manuscripts wearing caps and full nightshirts in bed together. The nightshirt and cap served a social function just as much as a practical one. So whether you were a noble, a servant, or a traveling soldier, climbing into bed didn't mean undressing for comfort. It meant dressing differently, layering up rather than down, engineered piece by piece against a long night of cold stone. Before anyone actually climbed into bed, there was often one more step, warming it first. Picture a servant approaching with a long-handled metal pan, its surface glowing faintly from the hot coals packed inside. This was the warming pan, a simple but genuinely clever tool, because nobody wanted to crawl into sheets that felt like sheets of ice. The process was straightforward. The servant slid the pan back and forth between the layers of bedding, the heat radiating out through small perforations in the metal. For a few minutes, a bed that had felt like a cold stone slab turned into something almost inviting. Without this step, a sleeper might lie shivering for a full hour before their own body heat finally took the edge off the chill. Warming pans show up regularly in noble household inventories, listed alongside candlesticks and other everyday items, not rare luxuries, but expected tools of winter life. By the later medieval period, wealthier homes across Europe treated them as a basic necessity. They weren't without risk, though. Several surviving letters complain about scorched or even burned bedsheets, the result of a servant leaving the pan in one spot too long. There are a handful of half-comic, half-alarming stories of people waking in the middle of the night to find sparks had caught their blankets in a room full of dry straw and rushes. One particularly memorable account from Italy describes sprinkling aromatic herbs directly onto the coals before warming a bed, the idea being that the resulting smoke helped purify the air and ward off illness. Picture that scent. Lavender or rosemary mixing with the sharp tang of hot embers, clinging faintly to the fabric as you finally climbed underneath. Specialists in medieval domestic life still discuss how common warming pans really were outside wealthy households. Some argue they were too expensive and too risky for ordinary families. Others point out that simpler versions existed too: clay pots filled with embers, wrapped in cloth, which left far less evidence behind because the materials were so humble. Either way, some method of pre-warming a bed seems to have existed across most of society, even if the exact form varied. Picture watching this happen in your imagined chamber. The servant draws the pan steadily across the sheets, faint steam rising as dampness evaporates. When it's withdrawn, the air under the covers feels unexpectedly warm, almost startling after the bitter cold of the room around you. You slide in quickly, trying to trap that warmth before it slips away. It never lasted the whole night. The trick was never about staying warm until morning. It was about surviving the first, hardest few minutes of getting into bed at all. Once your body relaxed and exhaustion took over, you were far more likely to drift off and let your own warmth carry you the rest of the way. In a sense, the warming pan was a small bargain struck with the night, a few minutes of real comfort, in exchange for enduring everything that came after. Often that extra warmth came from something even simpler than a heated pan, an animal sharing the bed itself. Dogs especially were valued for far more than companionship or guarding the household. They were quite literally heaters. A castle bedchamber that felt like an ice cave could become noticeably more bearable with even one large dog curled at the foot of the bed. Household records occasionally mention small lap dogs given to noblewomen specifically for this purpose, pampered, groomed, but valued above all for the warmth they provided through long winter nights. Larger breeds served a similar role, stretched out like furry logs across the bottom of the bed, protecting feet from the worst of the cold. There's an interesting account from Scandinavia describing travelers at winter inns who specifically requested to sleep in stalls alongside horses or cattle, rather than in unheated guest rooms upstairs. Large animals generate a surprising amount of body heat, and sleeping near them, hay, animal smell, and all, often beat a lonely, freezing room by a wide margin. A French proverb from the period captures the sentiment nicely, more or less translating to the idea that a loyal dog keeps the frost away from its master's heart, both literally, in terms of warmth, and emotionally, in terms of comfort on long, isolating nights. Historians remain divided on just how common this practice was among the nobility. Some argue that allowing animals into a formal bed was frowned upon in the most aristocratic households, treated as a private indulgence rather than open custom. Others believe the evidence suggests it was widespread, especially in more remote or frontier castles, where practicality outweighed etiquette. Picture the scene now. You're tucked into bed, layered in linen and wool, curtains drawn tight against the draft. Your toes ache faintly with cold, until suddenly you feel the solid warmth of a dog settle against them. Its fur is coarse, carrying a faint scent of the outdoors, but you welcome it without a second thought. Another dog curls in beside you, and slowly you find yourself wrapped not just in cloth, but in living warmth. There were trade-offs, naturally. Dogs shed, tracked in dirt, and brought fleas along with them. But weighed against the very real threat of frostbite, most people decided without much hesitation that a little extra mess was worth it. Better fleas than frozen toes, as the thinking seemed to go. The phrase "three-dog night," meaning a night so cold it took 3 dogs piled together to stay warm, actually comes from a much later period of folklore, but it captures something true about medieval sleeping habits. 1 dog meant a manageable chill. 2 meant real cold. 3 meant a night so brutal that even wealthy households were stacking every available source of warmth into one bed, including the family pets. Step outside the noble bedchamber for a moment, into the servants' quarters across the courtyard, and you find a different version of the same nightly struggle. The contrast between how nobles and ordinary people slept was sharp, and the answer to who actually slept warmer might surprise you. Nobles had grandeur on their side: feather beds, fur coverings, warming pans, heavy canopies. But grandeur didn't automatically translate into comfort. Their chambers were built large, for display as much as for rest, and all that extra space made the rooms genuinely difficult to heat. Even with a roaring fire nearby, the stone swallowed warmth faster than it could spread. A lord might be buried under furs and down, and still watch his own breath turn to mist in the air above him. Peasant homes, by contrast, were small enough that a single hearth could warm the entire interior. A thick thatched roof acted as natural insulation. Families slept close together, sometimes with animals stabled at one end of the same building, and the combined body heat kept the air noticeably more tolerable than in a drafty stone keep. One 14th century visitor to an English village apparently wrote with genuine surprise that the humble huts held warmth far better than the lord's own tower. And yet status still shaped the materials available to each group. Nobles had access to finer wool, imported furs, softer linen. Peasants made do with coarser wool, sheepskin cured roughly at home, blankets patched and repatched until they wore thin. Their bedding smelled strongly of hearth smoke and lanolin, practical rather than elegant, but often just as effective, or more so, at actually keeping someone warm through the night. Some records mention peasant families sleeping directly on benches near the fire, children curled in laps, accepting the risk of sparks and smoke in exchange for guaranteed warmth. Nobles, separated from the great hall by distance and architecture, often lacked that same immediate access to heat in their own private chambers. Researchers today still debate the real hierarchy of warmth during this period. Did wealth genuinely buy better sleep, given access to fur and feathers? Or did peasants, in their smaller and more communal spaces, actually manage the cold more effectively despite having far less material wealth? The honest answer seems to be that it depended heavily on the specific household, the season, and a fair amount of luck. Picture both scenes side by side. In the castle, a nobleman shifts under heavy layers, breath visible in cold air, the vast room echoing faintly with every gust against the shutters. In the village below, a peasant family squeezes onto a single straw mattress near the hearth, children nestled together, the smell of livestock drifting in from a nearby stall. One scene looks formal and impressive. The other looks crowded and humble. But on a cold January night, it's worth asking honestly which one actually slept better. Status, in other words, determined the trappings of medieval sleep far more reliably than it determined the actual quality of rest. You might assume a noble bedroom, once set up, stayed exactly the same year-round. In practice, that usually wasn't true. Families often shifted where they slept depending on the season, because bedrooms in this period weren't treated as fixed, permanent spaces. They were chosen based on their relationship to sunlight, fire, and wind. Records from several noble estates describe households maintaining distinct winter chambers and summer chambers. This wasn't about variety for its own sake. It came down to basic physics. In the coldest months, families moved into rooms with southern exposure, where even weak winter sunlight could strike through a window for a few hours each day, giving the stone walls a slight head start on retaining heat. Come summer, those same families retreated to cooler, north-facing rooms instead. One well-documented example comes from the household accounts of an English king, where entire beds and furnishings were physically relocated with the seasons. Servants carried feather mattresses, linens, and tapestries from one chamber to another, essentially rebuilding a temporary sleeping setup wherever the household settled for that part of the year. It was a significant logistical effort, but for people living inside stone buildings, that kind of mobility wasn't optional, it was necessary. A particular complaint survives from a continental courtier who apparently lost his usual chamber to dampness one winter, the walls growing so cold and wet that he refused to sleep there at all, choosing a smaller room facing the morning sun instead. His own words make the point clearly. In a castle, certain rooms could effectively be lost to the cold each year, conquered and reclaimed as the seasons shifted. Architectural historians still debate how widespread this seasonal rotation actually was. Some argue only the very grandest estates had enough spare rooms to bother with it, and that most households simply endured whatever room they had year-round. Others point to window placement, fireplace positioning, and surviving records as evidence that seasonal living was intentional, even fairly common, design. Picture following this routine yourself. As autumn arrives, you begin eyeing the sunlit side of the keep, knowing the long nights are coming. Servants dismantle your bed piece by piece and move it to the new room. Tapestries get rehung to block fresh drafts. By the time the first real frost sets in, you're sleeping in a room that at least greets you with a little pale morning light, rather than none at all. Peasants followed a rougher version of the same pattern, sleeping closer to the hearth in winter, and sometimes retreating to cooler lofts or barns in the height of summer. In both castles and cottages, where you slept wasn't fixed. It moved with the sun, the wind, and the cold, recalculated every year as the seasons turned. Stand for a moment near a window in one of these chambers, and you'd feel exactly why medieval people approached them with such caution. Unlike modern glass, sealed and double-paned, castle windows were essentially controlled holes in a defensive wall, useful for arrows, terrible for warmth. Glass itself was rare enough in this period that it was often reserved for chapels or a lord's most private rooms. Ordinary chambers made do with thick wooden shutters, barred from the inside, left open for light in summer and shut tight against the wind in winter, but would alone never fully solve the problem. Cold air still crept through the cracks, and the room stayed damp regardless. A common solution was stretching fabric across the window opening, sometimes linen treated with oil or wax to make it slightly translucent and more weather-resistant. By day, it let in a soft, hazy amber light, something like sunlight filtered through old parchment. By night, it dulled the sound of wind, though it never fully silenced it. One detail from a 13th century French household account describes thin sheets of scraped animal horn set into wooden window frames, a cruder but sturdier alternative to fabric. These let in pale, blurred light and held up to weather slightly better, though they yellowed and warped over time. Historians still debate how common these horn or old cloth windows actually were. Some argue they were luxuries limited to the wealthiest castles, with most households relying on plain shutters alone. Others suggest that, by the later medieval period, they'd become fairly widespread across northern Europe specifically. The disagreement itself says something important. People were clearly motivated to find some kind of barrier against the cold, even an imperfect one. Picture standing at such a window. The shutter is closed, the fabric stretched tight across the frame, and yet a thin line of frost still forms along the windowsill. Your breath fogs as you lean close. Outside, moonlight reflects faintly off snow. Inside, you can hear the faint rattle of the wooden frame and the low moan of wind searching for any remaining gap. Peasant homes often had no real windows at all, just narrow slits covered by shutters, sometimes stretched animal membrane in place of glass or horn. These let in a dim, distorted light during the day. At night, even that thin covering could harden with frost, turning briefly brittle and translucent. There's a strange irony in all of this. The tallest, most impressive towers built specifically to project power and offer the widest view were often also the coldest rooms in the entire castle, fully exposed to wind on every side. Guests occasionally remarked that the higher up they slept, the colder the night became. A peasant in a low, snug cottage might envy a lord's wealth, but not necessarily his drafty tower bedroom. Sleep, in the end, was never about fully shutting the cold out. It was about learning to live alongside it, draft by draft, night after night, until morning finally arrived. You might expect the fireplace itself to be the obvious hero of this story. In reality, it was more of a partial, frustrating ally. Medieval fireplaces were often enormous, their chimneys wide enough to swallow entire logs whole, but that very size worked against them. The wider the chimney, the more heat escaped straight upward along with the smoke. Flames could roar, sparks could fly, logs could collapse into glowing embers, and still, step just a few feet away, and your breath would fog in the air. The fire created a small, bright pocket of real warmth immediately around it. Beyond that pocket, the room stayed bitterly cold regardless of how large or impressive the fire looked. Maintaining this kind of fire demanded enormous amounts of fuel. Household records describe entire wagon loads of timber consumed in a single winter week at a large castle. Forest management became a genuine, ongoing concern, not just for building materials, but simply to keep households heated. One noble reportedly complained in his own letters that keeping his great hall warm through the winter had emptied his forests faster than any military campaign ever had. There's a wry observation that shows up more than once in period writing, that noble fireplaces were big enough to roast an entire ox, yet somehow too weak to properly warm a single man. The exaggeration captures something true. These hearths offered spectacle and a sense of grandeur, but only modest, localized relief from the cold. Some households experimented with iron firebacks placed behind the flames to reflect heat further into the room, or tile linings meant to retain warmth a little longer after the fire died down. These were genuine attempts at improvement, but only partial solutions to a problem that was, in many ways, simply too large to fully solve with the technology available. Scholars still debate how effective these fireplaces really were in practice. Some argue that, combined with tapestries and heavy furniture, they created a meaningfully layered system of heat retention. Others see them as more symbolic than practical markers of status and ritual gathering, given how much of their actual heat output vanished straight up the chimney. The truth likely varied castle by castle, depending on design, climate, and available resources. Picture sitting close to such a fire. It crackles loudly, throwing the occasional spark onto the hearthstones. Your face feels pleasantly flushed, almost too warm. Your shoulders, meanwhile, stay cold. You shuffle closer, holding your hands out until you're nearly close enough to singe your sleeves. Eventually, reluctantly, you retreat toward your bed across the room, and the temperature drops noticeably with every step you take away from the flames. Peasants, with their smaller, more centrally placed hearths, often benefited more from the same basic principle. A modest cottage fire could heat the whole interior reasonably well, simply because the space itself was small enough for the warmth to actually fill it. The grand noble fireplace, by contrast, burned through enormous resources while leaving most of its own room half frozen. Once again, grandeur didn't translate cleanly into comfort. Sitting close to that fire came with a real cost, though, and that cost was smoke. Medieval fireplaces weren't clean, efficient machines. They produced thick fumes, left soot on every surface, and filled rooms with a haze that stung the eyes and settled into fabric over time. Staying warm by the fire meant accepting smoke as a nightly companion. One monk's account from northern England complains that his quarters grew so coated in soot from the hearth that he coughed more during prayers than he managed to actually pray. Even wealthy households weren't immune. Court records mention noblewomen lamenting gowns and linens permanently discolored by constant smoke exposure. A freshly cleaned tapestry might turn visibly gray within a single winter season. The architecture made things worse rather than better. Chimneys were wide and crude, without the careful draft control of a modern flue. When wind blew from an unfavorable direction, smoke didn't rise politely up and out. It drifted back down into the room, leaving everyone inside coughing and wiping watering eyes. One curious detail from period travel writing describes people deliberately smearing lime or pale clay over their walls, partly to brighten the room, but largely to disguise the streaks of soot building up over time. The visual grime could be temporarily hidden. The smell, unfortunately, tended to linger permanently, a mix of charred wood, damp stone, and burnt wool that worked its way into bedding and clothing alike. Historians remain divided on just how tolerable people actually found these smoky conditions. Some argue people simply adapted over time, their expectations, and even their tolerance shifting to match daily reality. Others point to repeated complaints in period medical writing about choked air and blackened lungs as evidence that contemporaries were well aware of the health toll, even if they had no real alternative. Both views likely hold some truth. People endured because they had no real choice, but they never stopped grumbling about it either. Picture lying in bed after an evening spent near the fire. Your hair carries the faint scent of smoke. Your blankets hold a similar trace, sharp and slightly bitter. When you cough, you can taste it faintly on your tongue. Even your bed curtains, drawn tight for warmth, trap some of that smoky air inside your small private cocoon along with the heat. Peasant cottages often had it worse in this specific respect, frequently lacking proper chimneys altogether. Smoke from a central hearth simply rose and filled the rafters, slowly working its way out through gaps in the thatch roof overhead. Children in these households grew up in homes that stayed perpetually hazy, and it was simply treated as normal. Some even believed the smoke had a side benefit of helping preserve the wooden roof by discouraging insects. Warmth and clean air, in other words, were rarely available together. Every winter became a quiet trade-off, accept the smoke, or accept the cold. Most people, given the choice, chose the smoke. When the fire eventually burned low and the night stretched on, the only remaining glow in a chamber often came from a single candle. It's easy to think of candlelight purely as ambience, but for many medieval sleepers it also represented a small, genuine source of warmth. A single wick obviously couldn't heat an entire room, but in a world where every flicker of warmth counted, even a candle's modest heat output mattered. Wealthier households burned beeswax candles, which produced a clean flame and a faint honeyed scent, expensive enough that they were often reserved for chapels or a lord's private chamber. Most people instead relied on tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, which smoked more, sputtered occasionally, and carried a noticeably greasier smell. Placed close enough to a bed curtain, a candle could noticeably warm the fabric to the touch. Some households arranged several candles together specifically to create small clusters of both light and modest heat. It was nowhere near central heating, but it took just enough of the edge off the cold in the immediate area. One 14th century account describes a noblewoman insisting on 12 candles burning in her chamber on the coldest winter nights, convinced that only then could she properly rest. Her servants apparently grumbled at the expense, but her insistence reveals something real. People genuinely used light as a kind of substitute, low-grade heater, even when its actual effect was fairly limited. The risks were obvious and sometimes serious. Candle flames could tip over easily, and bed curtains made of wool and linen were dangerously flammable. Several surviving records describe fires sparked by carelessly placed candles, occasionally destroying entire bedchambers. One particularly dramatic account from Germany describes a young squire who fell asleep with a candle still burning on the bed rail, waking just in time to find his blankets on fire and barely escaping unharmed. Historians still discuss whether people genuinely understood these risks or whether the routine, nightly use of candles simply bred a certain complacency over time. Either way, the balance between modest comfort and real danger was a constant, accepted part of medieval nights. Picture the scene yourself. The hearth has dwindled to embers, shadows climbing the walls. A single candle burns on a small wooden stand near your bed, casting a soft golden circle that just barely reaches your hands as you pull the covers tighter. Wax drips slowly down its side. The faint smell of smoke hangs in the air. Beyond your bed curtains, the rest of the room disappears into darkness, your entire world reduced to this small circle of light and warmth. In simpler homes and travelers' inns, a cheaper version of the same idea played out using rushlights, thin reeds dipped in fat, burning quickly and unevenly beside a straw mattress. Even monks, despite valuing simplicity and restraint, often allowed small lamps to burn through the night in shared dormitories, citing both safety and basic comfort. The candle, in the end, wasn't simply decorative. In the depths of winter, it was a small, fragile ally, warming just enough to make rest possible, while risking disaster with every spark. Step away from private noble chambers for a moment, into the shared dormitories where monks, soldiers, and servants typically slept. Not everyone had access to heavy curtains, feather beds, and private attendants. For a large portion of medieval society, warmth came less from fine materials and more from simple proximity to other people. Monastic dormitories offer a clear example. Monastic life emphasized simplicity, which in practice meant long stone halls lined with rows of simple beds or straw pallets, often close enough that one monk could easily hear the next one breathing. Privacy was essentially non-existent. Warmth, instead, came from sheer numbers. One chronicler reportedly remarked that the communal dormitory ended up warmer than the Lord's own private tower, simply because the monks slept packed together like sheaves of wheat. Military life followed a similar pattern. Soldiers stationed in castles or out on campaign often crowded into long barrack halls, sleeping in rows on straw, blankets and cloaks shared and doubled up as needed. The air carried a heavy mix of sweat, leather, and smoke, but for exhausted men, sleeping shoulder to shoulder made the cold genuinely more bearable. One detail from certain monastic rules mentions candles deliberately kept burning through the night in these shared halls, not purely for practical light, but explicitly described as a comfort to the men. The psychological value of that small, steady flame seems to have mattered almost as much as any actual heat it produced. Historians continue to debate whether this kind of communal sleeping was a deliberate strategy for warmth, or simply a natural byproduct of necessity that happened to align with monastic ideals of humility. The same question applies to soldiers. Did they bunk together primarily out of camaraderie, or because solitary sleep in the cold simply wasn't practical? The honest answer is probably both, intertwined. Picture lying in one of these halls yourself. Straw shifts beneath you with every small movement. A neighbor coughs somewhere nearby. The sound carries oddly under the high, vaulted stone ceiling. Smoke and sweat hang in the air, but it feels noticeably less sharp than the isolating cold of a private chamber. You pull your blanket a little tighter, grateful for the collective warmth even while wishing, quietly, for a bit more silence. Apprentices and household servants lived in similarly cramped conditions. Straw pallets rolled out inside rooms, lofts, or even storage spaces, sometimes tucked beneath staircases. They couldn't command warming pans or feather mattresses, but their smaller, more crowded quarters often retained heat more efficiently than a noble's grand, echoing chamber ever could. So while monks chanted evening prayers before extinguishing their lamps, and soldiers settled into rows after a long day, and servants curled together in tucked-away corners, all of them were relying on the same basic principle. Warmth, in these spaces, came less from silk and fur, and far more from each other. Even in a crowded dormitory, warmth still required constant, active maintenance. Someone always had to get up in the middle of the night to tend a dying fire. Medieval sleep, as a result, was rarely the single, unbroken stretch we expect today. In fact, the medieval relationship with sleep itself worked differently from ours. Many historians describe a pattern of segmented sleep, a first stretch lasting from dusk until roughly midnight, followed by a period of quiet wakefulness, and then a second stretch carrying through until dawn. In the coldest months, that middle waking period often revolved specifically around fire maintenance. Without attention, embers died out completely, and a chamber could become genuinely unbearable by the early hours. One well-known account comes from a 15th century physician who recommended using this natural waking period for quiet reflection or conversation. To him, it was simply a normal part of the night's rhythm. To the servant actually trudging across a freezing stone floor to feed fresh logs onto dying embers, it was far less philosophical and far more about basic duty. Some rural households assigned informal watch duties specifically to manage the fire through the night, with adults taking turns rising to check on it. In monasteries, bells ringing at set intervals for prayer had the convenient side effect of ensuring someone was reliably awake to tend the hearth as well. Sleep, in this context, wasn't a fully private withdrawal from the world. It was a shared rhythm, punctuated by ongoing responsibility. Historians debate whether this segmented sleep pattern was universal or more specific to Northern Europe, where winter nights stretched especially long. Some argue it was simply a practical response to the sheer length of darkness. Others suggest it may have been more of a cultural habit, not entirely tied to geography. Either way, tending the fire clearly sat at the center of these nighttime rhythms. Picture waking in the dead of night yourself. The room is mostly silent except for scattered breathing nearby. You push back the blanket, feel a sharp slap of cold air against bare skin, and fumble in the dark for a fresh log. Your feet find straw on the floor. Your breath rises in visible plumes. Your fingers sting slightly as you stir the dying coals back to life. Sparks flare, the wood catches, reluctant at first, and warmth slowly begins pooling back into the room. You sigh with relief, knowing the others nearby will rest undisturbed a little longer because of it. Peasant households followed a similar rhythm, often with even less margin for error. Open hearths without proper grates meant a careless or sleepy night could risk a fire dying completely, or worse, spreading dangerously. Someone in the household nearly always stayed alert enough to adjust logs and check embers through the night. Medieval nights, in other words, weren't passive stretches of pure unconsciousness. They were actively managed, monitored, and quietly guarded, hour by hour, by someone willing to brave the cold floor and keep the fire from dying before dawn. Beyond fire tending, medieval people also turned to food and drink as a deliberate strategy for surviving cold nights. What you ate before bed, and the warmth it left behind in your body, mattered nearly as much as any blanket. In winter, households leaned heavily on thick pottages. Hearty stews of barley, peas, and root vegetables simmered slowly over the hearth. These meals left a heavy, lingering warmth in the stomach that made a cold chamber a little easier to face. Wealthier households enriched the dish with meat and imported spices, while peasant versions relied mainly on onions, cabbage, and whatever was available that season. One 15th century English manuscript recommends eating leeks specifically at night, claiming they warmed the body and helped ward off the chill. Whether or not the science held up, it shows how closely diet and survival against the cold were linked in people's minds. A hot meal wasn't just nourishment. It was treated as a form of insulation from the inside out. Drinks played an equally important role. Ale, consumed warm in winter by rich and poor alike, provided both calories and a sense of immediate comfort. Spiced wine, sometimes called hippocras, became a favorite among nobles, gently heated and seasoned with imported cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. Picture sipping something like that in a smoky chamber, the scent of exotic spices mixing with wool and ash, the warmth spreading slowly through your chest. One account from the French royal court mentions a physician specifically recommending hot mead at night to keep chill from settling into the bones, reasoning rooted in period medical theory about balancing the body's internal fluids, though the underlying instinct isn't far removed from our modern habit of drinking something warm before bed. Scholars still debate how much of this warmth was genuinely physical versus largely psychological. Some argue that alcohol simply dulled perception, making people feel warmer than they actually were. Others point to the real caloric value these drinks provided, genuinely helping the body generate heat through a long, cold night? The honest answer is probably some mix of both. Picture preparing for bed with a warm cup of spiced wine in hand. Steam rises gently from the surface, carrying a wave of spice into the air. You drink slowly, feeling the liquid's warmth spread as it goes down. Your muscles loosen slightly. By the time you climb into bed, the blankets feel a little less oppressive, a little more inviting. For ordinary families, the ritual was simpler but no less important. A bowl of hot porridge, thickened with oats or barley, lined the stomach before bed. Families gathered around the hearth to eat together, faces lit by firelight, fueling up for the long, cold night ahead. Children scraped the last bits from wooden spoons before curling up under blankets, the memory of that warm meal helping them tune out the draft slipping in through the shutters. Food, in short, wasn't separate from the larger fight against the cold. It was simply another layer of defense, an invisible one, working from the inside, alongside every blanket, fire, and fur piled on top. Some of the most vulnerable people in any medieval household were the very young and the very old. Children and elderly family members had less natural resilience against extreme cold, and their survival often depended heavily on extra care and deliberate attention from those around them. Household records from noble families show that children rarely had their own separate, isolated chambers. Instead, they typically slept close to kitchens or alongside servants, where ambient warmth was easier to come by. Infants especially were swaddled in multiple layers of linen and wool, often kept in a cradle positioned right beside the hearth, or sometimes even inside the mother's own bed, where her body heat offered direct protection through the night. One 14th century account describes a noble infant kept in a wicker crib near the fire, wrapped in fur and covered by a small canopy of its own, a level of care that hints at just how seriously families took the threat winter posed to their youngest members. Even with these precautions, illness and cold claimed many young lives during harsh seasons, and parents lived with a real, constant awareness of that risk. Elderly family members faced a similar vulnerability. In peasant cottages, grandparents were often given the spot closest to the fire, while younger, hardier family members accepted colder positions further away. In wealthier households, older relatives were sometimes moved into smaller, easier-to-heat rooms during the coldest months, occasionally even relocated near working kitchens for the residual warmth. Medical texts from the period often included specific advice for protecting the young and old from cold: heated stones wrapped in cloth placed near the feet, warm drinks meant to fortify circulation, careful monitoring through the night. Physicians of the time warned that a sudden chill could be dangerous in a way that healthier adults might shrug off entirely. Historians still discuss whether this extra attention reflected deep, deliberate compassion, or whether families simply applied the same general survival strategies to everyone, with children and elders naturally receiving a slightly larger share given their vulnerability. Given how high mortality rates remained even with these precautions, the honest picture probably involves both real care and real limits on what any family could practically guarantee. Picture a winter night in a modest peasant home. An infant lies tightly swaddled nearby. A grandmother dozes close to the hearth, the glow of the embers warming her face faintly. Parents make sure both have the warmest available spots, while children pile together on a shared straw mattress nearby, drifting off one by one. In a noble household, the scene looks different but carries the same underlying concern. A nursemaid quietly tending a cradle near the fire, while elsewhere an elderly relative insists on having her bed curtains drawn especially tight, a servant placing warmed stones near her feet for extra reassurance. In both worlds, the very young and the very old required the most careful attention, and sometimes, despite every effort, that still wasn't quite enough. It's a reminder that medieval sleep was never purely an individual struggle. It was, in many real ways, a community effort, with the most vulnerable carried through winter by the collective care and vigilance of everyone around them. The cold didn't just affect comfort. It shaped how medieval people understood health itself. To the medieval mind, chill wasn't simply unpleasant. It was considered genuinely dangerous, capable of disrupting the body's internal balance and inviting illness. Medicine in this period revolved largely around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and physicians believed temperature played a direct role in keeping those fluids properly balanced. Too much cold, the thinking went, and the humors thickened or stagnated, opening the door to sickness. Medical writings from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with nighttime advice built around this idea. One manual recommends rubbing the feet with warm oil before bed, specifically to open the pores and release trapped cold. Another suggests warm milk sweetened with honey to settle the stomach and keep the humors moving properly. To these physicians, warmth wasn't just comfort. It was treated as a genuine form of medicine, applied through food, drink, clothing, and even physical closeness to others. One French surgeon reportedly warned that sleeping in a damp chamber could encourage melancholy by chilling the black bile specifically, and recommended hanging tapestries not purely for decoration, but as a genuine medical precaution. It's a striking idea, being told by a physician that an undecorated wall might contribute to low spirits, simply because of how the cold interacted with the body. Folk remedies flourished alongside this more formal medical theory. Some people rubbed garlic or onion on the soles of their feet before bed, believing it helped prevent chills from settling into the body. One English herbal source even suggests keeping a live rooster in the bedroom, specifically to draw frost away from its human occupants. Whether anyone actually slept next to a rooster on these grounds is hard to say, but the belief itself reflects just how seriously people searched for any possible defense. Modern scholars still debate how effective any of these specific remedies actually were. Some argue warm oils and heated drinks provided real, if modest, physical benefit, improving circulation slightly, easing tension. Others see most of these practices as largely symbolic, offering psychological reassurance more than measurable physical change. The disagreement continues, but what's certain is that people at the time believed in these rituals completely. Picture preparing for bed under this kind of advice. A servant massages warm oil into your feet, the scent of rosemary filling the room. You drink a small cup of honeyed wine, feeling it settle warmly in your stomach. A sprig of garlic rests near the bed, pungent but trusted, meant to keep frost at bay. You climb under the covers, reasonably convinced that these small rituals will help carry your body safely through to morning. Peasant households had their own parallel remedies. Herbal teas brewed for children believed to prevent coughs, legs wrapped in vinegar-soaked wool to keep circulation strong. The line between superstition and practical medicine blurred easily, but these practices gave ordinary people a real sense of agency in a world where serious illness often felt unpredictable and largely uncontrollable. There's a quiet irony running through all of this. Many of the very strategies used to fight the cold, smoky fires, heavy oily ointments, thick unwashed blankets, likely contributed to other health problems of their own. But to the medieval mind, those were minor, acceptable costs measured against the much larger threat of letting the cold take hold unchecked. Even with fires tended, bodies layered in wool and fur, and every folk remedy applied, there were nights when none of it proved quite enough. Step into a castle chamber at the deepest point of winter, and you might witness something genuinely unsettling, frost forming on the inside of the walls. Imagine waking to find delicate patterns of ice tracing the stone beside your bed, or discovering your wash basin frozen completely solid overnight. The cold, on nights like these, didn't stay politely outside. It moved in and quietly redecorated the room. Several surviving letters describe households waking to frost coating their bed curtains, the moisture from their own breath having crystallized overnight into something resembling delicate silver thread. Archaeological evidence in a number of preserved castles supports these written accounts. Faint salt and moisture staining on old stone suggests exactly this kind of repeated condensation and freezing over many winters. Without proper insulation, warm indoor air meeting freezing stone simply produced frost, night after night, regardless of how carefully a room had been prepared. One unusual account from Scandinavia describes icicles forming directly on indoor rafters, occasionally dripping onto sleepers below. Some households apparently hung cloths specifically to catch this indoor meltwater. A strange, almost absurd-sounding solution to a genuinely strange problem. Historians still discuss how widespread this indoor frost actually was. Some argue it was largely confined to the harshest northern European winters. Others point out that even temperate regions had poorly heated stone chambers easily capable of dropping to freezing overnight. The likely truth is that severity varied considerably by region, but the basic risk of waking up to ice indoors was never entirely absent anywhere stone castles stood through a real winter. Picture waking yourself in the gray light of early morning. Your breath fogs immediately in the cold air. The bed curtains feel stiff, edged faintly with frost crystals. Reaching for the wash basin, your fingers meet solid ice instead of water. Your joints ache slightly from the cold, and the thought of actually leaving the warmth of your blankets feels like a genuine, dreaded task. Peasant cottages dealt with a rougher version of the same problem, frost coating the inside of thatch and exposed rafters, occasionally drifting down like a fine dusting of snow overnight. Children sometimes woke with frost clinging faintly to their hair. Parents made grim jokes about sleeping with the clouds indoors, though the underlying hardship, increased risk of frostbite, chilblains, respiratory illness, was no laughing matter. Even wealthy nobles couldn't fully escape this reality despite every fur and stone hot water bottle at their disposal. Diary entries from the period hint at a real psychological toll. People writing about dreading the specific moment each morning when they had to leave the relative safety of their blankets and face a room that felt nearly as harsh as the world outside. So when picturing medieval sleep, it's worth holding onto this strange detail. To live in a castle in the depths of winter sometimes meant quite literally sharing your bedroom with ice, scraping it away each morning, only to watch it return again the following night. Now picture yourself not safely inside a castle at all, but out on the road, far from any familiar bed. Medieval travel was slow and often genuinely dangerous, and when night fell, the question of warmth became even more urgent for anyone without a permanent home nearby. Castles had their hearths and tapestries. Peasant cottages had family and a single shared fire. But travelers, pilgrims, merchants, wandering knights had to take whatever shelter they could find, and that usually meant an inn. The medieval inn rarely resembled a cozy postcard image. More often, it was a simple timber building with a smoky common room, crowded sleeping quarters, and beds shared among complete strangers. Guests might find themselves packed 3 or 4 to a single mattress, blankets stretched thin across everyone. Still, inns offered one genuinely valuable thing: collective heat. A shared hall fire combined with the body warmth of dozens of crowded guests multiplied whatever comfort was available. One 15th century Italian traveler complained at length about fleas in the bedding, but admitted in the same breath that the sheer number of people sleeping nearby had kept him from freezing. Some inns were equipped so poorly that travelers occasionally chose to sleep in the stables instead, alongside the horses. At first this sounds like a step down, but many travelers actually preferred it. Animals generate substantial body heat, and a stable packed with livestock could feel considerably warmer than a drafty upstairs guest room. Pilgrims along well-known religious routes occasionally wrote about choosing animal stalls on purpose, curling up against hay bales specifically for the warmth. In smaller villages, older traditions of hospitality sometimes took over entirely. Local families were often expected to open their homes to travelers, especially pilgrims. A peasant household might offer a spot by their own fire, or space on a shared straw pallet. Warmth here came not from any special equipment, but simply from generosity and physical closeness. Sleeping shoulder to shoulder with strangers, listening to a humble hearth crackle nearby. One 14th century French account describes a communal inn featuring a single long wooden platform covered in straw, where dozens of travelers, men and women together, simply lay down side by side for the night. The idea might feel unusual by modern standards, but at the time it was simply normal. Shared warmth outweighed any sense of awkwardness. Scholars debate whether these crowded inns actually offered more genuine comfort than castle life. Some argue that, despite the crowding and lack of hygiene, they retained heat noticeably better than vast noble chambers ever could. Others point to real risks, lice, theft, disease, and argue that castle life, cold as it was, at least offered greater safety. Both perspectives have merit. For a tired traveler on a winter night, the real choice often came down to cold isolation versus crowded, imperfect warmth. Picture entering one of these inns yourself. Voices and firelight greet you immediately. The smell of ale, smoke, and roasting meat fills the air. A space clears on a shared straw pallet and you settle in beside strangers. Later, as the hall quiets and conversation gives way to scattered snoring, you feel the warmth of bodies pressed close nearby, embers glowing faintly in the hearth. It isn't comfort in any refined sense, but it was, on most nights, enough. Not every night ended safely, and the medieval world left behind its share of stories, part history, part cautionary legend, about people who faced cold so severe it became unforgettable. Sleeping in a castle meant fighting an invisible opponent, and occasionally, that opponent won. One 13th century chronicle describes guards stationed on a castle wall in Flanders during a particularly brutal winter siege, found by their comrades the next morning frozen in place, still upright, spears in hand. The chronicler recorded it less as personal tragedy and more as a kind of proof of winter's raw power, as though the cold itself had simply won that particular battle. Other surviving accounts feel more personal in tone. One letter from a noblewoman in Burgundy describes a visiting cousin from Italy who reportedly trembled through an entire night, begging for dawn, having never experienced cold quite that severe before. He survived, and the story was apparently retold afterward with a fair amount of teasing, though underneath the humor sat a real acknowledgement of just how frightening that kind of night could feel. A folk tale from Scandinavia describes a new bride collapsing shortly after entering her husband's cold stone keep for the first time, with villagers attributing it afterward to ice spirits from the north. Whether the underlying cause was simple illness or genuine exposure, the story persisted as a kind of warning. Even noble marriages, it suggested, could be tested by stone walls and harsh winter wind. Historians remain divided on how literally to take these accounts. Were they dramatized over time, turning ordinary hardship into something closer to legend? Or do they reflect genuinely severe losses to frostbite and hypothermia in a world without any real insulation to fall back on? Some scholars believe chroniclers inflated these stories deliberately, as moral lessons about taking winter seriously. Others see them as fairly accurate records of a climate noticeably harsher, in practical terms, than what most of us experience today. Picture hearing one of these stories told aloud in a great hall, fire burning low, shadows moving across the walls as an old retainer describes a knight who reportedly died in his sleep simply because he trusted too few blankets. Children listening nearby pull their own cloaks a little tighter. Stories like this clearly served more than entertainment. They functioned as genuine warnings. Take the cold seriously, or it will eventually take something from you. Alongside these grim accounts, though, there were plenty of stories celebrating endurance instead. Peasant families took quiet pride in winters survived through closeness and shared fire. Nobles celebrated successful hunts and feasts in the depths of winter, as a kind of proof that wealth and preparation could overcome the season. For every story of loss, there seems to have been a matching story of resilience, framing simple survival itself as a genuine, hard-won victory. Perhaps that's exactly why these legends of frozen guards and shivering travelers persisted so long. They reminded people that castles, for all their imposing strength, were never truly invulnerable. Stone walls could stop an army. They could not on their own stop a long enough winter. At last, return to the hearth, the one element that touched nearly every part of this story. The fire was never simply a tool. In many real ways, it was the emotional and practical center of the entire household, the thin line separating a survivable winter night from a genuinely dangerous one. Its presence shaped nearly every sense in the room. The crack and snap of burning oak, sparks rising briefly before vanishing up the chimney, the smell of wood smoke clinging to tapestries and clothing for days afterward, heat radiating unevenly, warming your face while your back stayed cold. In many ways, the hearth was a contradiction, both genuine lifeline and constant source of smoke, soot, and risk, all at once. For nobles, a large, well-maintained fire also carried real social weight. It signaled wealth, the ability to command enough servants and fuel to keep flames burning steadily through an entire winter. Some households reportedly employed dedicated servants whose primary job was simply making sure the hearth never went fully cold. Letting it die out wasn't just inconvenient, it carried a real sense of household failure. Poorer families gathered around their own much smaller fires with what seems to have been a similarly genuine sense of importance. Peasants sitting on packed earth floors, sharing space with livestock, watching flames lick at rough logs, telling stories and passing around bowls of stew. The setting looked completely different from a carved stone noble hearth, but the underlying comfort and the underlying necessity were essentially the same. One traveler's account from a German village describes locals gathering around the hearth each evening, stretching their hands toward the flames and quietly speaking words that sounded almost like a blessing before heading to bed, as if the fire itself carried some of their hopes safely through the night. It's a small detail, but it captures something real about how deeply practical necessity and genuine ritual blended together in everyday medieval life. Historians still debate how much of this reverence toward fire was purely practical instinct dressed up as custom, versus something closer to genuine spiritual significance. The most reasonable answer is probably that both were true simultaneously. People living this close to real danger naturally attach deeper meaning to the one thing reliably keeping that danger at bay. Picture yourself one final time in this imagined castle. Bed curtains drawn, blankets piled high, wind pressing against the towers outside. In the great hearth far below, embers still glow faintly, their light slipping through cracks in distant doorways. You close your eyes, listening to the low sigh of dying flames, aware that this thin, fragile glow is what's been holding the worst of the cold at bay all night. In the end, castles were genuinely formidable against armies, but never truly against winter itself. What actually carried people through these long, cold nights wasn't stone or steel. It was resourcefulness, careful ritual, and above all, the people and animals sharing that warmth together. Against an endless medieval winter, human ingenuity and human closeness turned out to be the real, lasting fire.